Are you going to pay with prayers? The words cut through the showroom like a blade. Jimmy Swaggart, the world-renowned televangelist and gospel singer, had spent decades preaching, singing, and reaching millions across nations. Yet behind the lights of television studios, the music of the piano, and the roar of congregations, there still lived within him a simple man, a man who never forgot his humble beginnings in Louisiana. As a child, Jimmy grew up in a small Pentecostal church where his family lived modestly. His earliest memories were of hymns echoing through wooden pews, afternoons spent helping around the house, and evenings when the only entertainment was an upright piano and a well-worn Bible. That humility, far from being erased by fame, remained like a compass pointing him back to who he truly was. One ordinary morning, Jimmy woke with an idea that to others might seem trivial, but to him felt like a personal milestone. After years of driving the same old cars, he decided it was time to give himself a gift, not for vanity, but as a symbol of hard work, persistence, and God's faithfulness in his life. He wanted a new vehicle, something to remind him that dreams, no matter how simple, deserve to come true. His wife suggested sending an assistant, as he usually did with errands of that sort, but Jimmy refused. He wanted the experience for himself. To hear the engines, to feel the steering wheels, to breathe in the scent of new leather. What seemed like a small decision would soon unfold into an unforgettable lesson. That morning he dressed simply, as always. No expensive suits, no flashy accessories, just a modest, slightly wrinkled suit, a plain tie, and his well-used Bible tucked under his arm. He looked like any small-town preacher stepping out for an errand. Yet this appearance would ignite the prejudices of those he was about to meet. With steady steps, he walked into the largest dealership in the city. It was an imposing place with shining glass walls reflecting the morning sun, brand new vehicles gleaming under spotlights, and sharply dressed salesmen who moved with the confidence of men used to entertaining politicians, businessmen, and celebrities. Neon signs promised financing plans, promotions, and the latest models that made any passerby pause in awe. The moment Jimmy stepped inside, the aroma of fresh leather and polished chrome enveloped him. His eyes wandered over rows of vehicles lined up like soldiers ready for inspection. He smiled faintly, remembering his youth when he dreamed of having a car of his own, but could barely afford an old piano instead. But soon the atmosphere shifted. As he walked calmly between the displays, he felt the eyes of the salesmen on him. Some glanced at him with suspicion, as if wondering why such a plainly dressed preacher had stepped into a place reserved, at least in their minds, for the wealthy. Others tried to hide their doubts, but their body language betrayed them. Jimmy, long accustomed to scrutiny from television cameras and congregations, did not flinch. He moved serenely, pausing to admire each detail of the vehicles before him. What he didn't know was that these first moments would mark the beginning of a test, one that would measure his patience, his dignity, and his faith. In his mind, the thought repeated itself. He wanted to find the perfect car. It wasn't about the price. Money had not been his challenge for years. It was about granting himself a small but meaningful gift. Yet what he was about to experience would remind him that in this life, it often doesn't matter what one has achieved, but how others judge by appearances. So began Jimmy Swaggart's dream that day. A dream that started as a simple search for a car, but would soon become a story of humiliation, revelation, and a lesson no one in that dealership would ever forget. The glass doors opened slowly as Jimmy, with his calm stride and Bible in hand, stepped into the showroom. The sound of his shoes echoed against the polished marble floor, reflecting the cold white lights above. Everything was designed to impress. Luxury vehicles arranged strategically, glass cases filled with brochures, and soft background music meant to create an atmosphere of exclusivity. He moved slowly with the unhurried air of a man who was not rushed by the world, observing each vehicle with genuine interest. For him, every detail mattered: the lines of the bodywork, the craftsmanship of the interiors, the power of engines he imagined roaring down the highway. But while his eyes filled with admiration, others' eyes filled with suspicion. From a corner, two salesmen exchanged knowing glances. Their tailored suits and silk ties gave them the confidence of men used to dismissing those who didn't look wealthy enough. One lifted an eyebrow, the other smirked. "Look at him," one whispered. "He's probably just here to browse." "Yeah, or to collect brochures to dream about later," the other chuckled under his breath. They didn't know that the man they mocked had touched millions with his sermons and hymns. For now, they saw only a preacher with plain clothes and nothing more. The words of mockery never reached Jimmy's ears, but the atmosphere of mistrust was impossible to ignore. He felt the weight of skeptical stares pressing against him, yet he remained calm. Through the years, he had learned that true greatness never needs to shout nor flaunt riches. His wealth was measured in faith, in simplicity, and in the quiet strength of humility. A young salesman, perhaps the most eager of the group, approached him with a forced smile. He held a tablet full of glossy digital catalogs, a luxury pen tucked neatly into his pocket. "Good afternoon, sir," the salesman greeted, pausing as if expecting Jimmy to introduce himself. "Good afternoon," Jimmy replied warmly, adding nothing more. The salesman studied him from head to toe. That modest, slightly wrinkled suit, the plain tie, and the well-used Bible under his arm did not match the profile of the usual luxury SUV buyer, the kind of men who left that place signing contracts worth hundreds of thousands. "Are you looking for something in particular?" the young man asked, trying to sound courteous, though doubt lingered in his eyes. "I'm just looking," Jimmy answered with a serene smile. "I want to take a car home, but I haven't decided which one yet." The salesman blinked in surprise. The confidence in Jimmy's tone unsettled him for a moment, but he quickly regained his professional facade. Of course," he replied. "We have many models, though perhaps there are more affordable options at other dealerships. Here we deal with the latest technology, imported engines, luxury finishes." The insinuation was clear. This man did not belong there. Meanwhile, the other salesmen watched from a distance. Some smirked, others shrugged. The atmosphere buzzed with disbelief, as if they all shared the same thought. He won't buy anything. Jimmy continued his walk undisturbed, running his hand over the wheel of a gleaming black sedan, admiring the spaciousness of a white SUV that seemed perfect for long journeys. His eyes lit up like a child in a toy store, but the more excitement he displayed, the more their skepticism deepened. One salesman, middle-aged with a perfectly trimmed mustache, approached with a mocking tone. "Excuse me, sir," he said. "Are you sure you want to look at these models? Maybe we can show you something more accessible." The false kindness carried a poisoned edge. Jimmy met his gaze, calm as ever, and simply replied, "I want to see them all." The salesman faltered, retreating with a nervous smile. He hadn't expected such certainty from this quiet preacher. Yet the whispers and laughter persisted. What was a moment of joyful anticipation for Jimmy, choosing a new car, had turned into a silent test of humanity for the staff. A test many of them were about to fail. The tension grew thicker with every step he took. Then came the spark. Jimmy approached one of the most imposing SUVs in the showroom, the kind designed for executives and international magnates. The metallic paint gleamed under the lights, reflecting in his eyes with quiet delight. As he laid his hand gently on the door, as if touching a dream, a cluster of salesmen gathered nearby, trading smirks and stifled chuckles. Finally, the most experienced among them delivered the blow, convinced that the visitor was nothing more than a penniless dreamer. "Do you like that SUV, Pastor?" he asked, his tone laced with venom. "Yes, very much," Jimmy answered softly. "It's exactly the kind of vehicle I want." The words triggered a wave of suppressed laughter among the group. Encouraged by their grins, the veteran salesman crossed his arms, stepped closer with an air of superiority, and delivered the phrase that would ignite the room. "And how do you plan to pay for it? With prayers?" The laughter was no longer hidden. It erupted openly, ringing out through the showroom like a cruel chorus. Two of the salesmen broke into open laughter, while others covered their mouths, trying to hide their mockery. To them, the remark was clever, a perfect joke to ridicule someone who, in their prejudice, did not belong in such a place. The silence that followed was heavy. Jimmy remained motionless, his hand still resting on the SUV's door. His deep eyes fixed calmly on the salesman who had humiliated him. He did not answer immediately. There were no shouts, no signs of anger, only a serene silence, so uncomfortable that it slowly smothered the laughter. Yet the wound was already inflicted. A few customers in the showroom had witnessed the exchange. One woman whispered in disapproval, "What disrespect?" But the salesman ignored her. Another, wearing a smug smile, added, "Pastor, these vehicles are for people who can actually pay for them. Maybe you'd be more comfortable at a used car lot. What do you think?" The words, dripping with sarcasm, landed like a second blow. To them, Jimmy was not a worthy customer, just an intruder out of place. Jimmy drew a deep breath, not to muster rage, but to summon dignity. His entire life had taught him that appearances deceive, and that a man's worth is never measured by his clothes or his outward image. Still, it hurt to be treated this way. His silence, far from being understood as patience, was mistaken for weakness. The salesman believed they had won the battle. One even muttered under his breath, thinking Jimmy wouldn't hear, "He probably would barely walked here. I doubt he even owns a bicycle." The insult spread like poison, but Jimmy stood firm. He knew this was not the moment to reveal who he truly was. His eyes, though calm, carried a glimmer of pain mixed with compassion, not for himself, but for those men who had yet to learn how to treat others with respect. At that moment, a child tugged gently at Jimmy's sleeve. With innocent curiosity, he asked, "Sir, I know you. My grandmother watches your sermons every Sunday morning. You're Reverend Swaggart, aren't you?" The question cracked through the air like thunder. The room fell instantly silent. The salesmen, who had been laughing, froze in place. Their eyes widened and the color drained from their faces. Jimmy, with a warm smile, bent slightly toward the boy and answered, "Yes, son, that's me." Those simple words were enough to shift the entire atmosphere of the dealership. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Customers who had previously watched indifferently now stared in awe. The man who had been mocked moments earlier was, in fact, one of the most recognized voices of gospel and preaching in America. The salesmen scrambled to compose themselves, but it was too late. The humiliation they had intended to inflict had turned into a mirror reflecting their arrogance. Jimmy didn't need to shout, nor did he need revenge. In that very instant, justice had been served. What none of them realized was that this revelation was only the beginning, and what Reverend Swaggart would do next would exceed every expectation, leaving a lesson that no one in that dealership would ever forget. The echo of the boy's words, "You're Reverend Swaggart, aren't you?" still lingered in the air. The confirmation had transformed the atmosphere completely. Where there had been laughter and ridicule, there now reigned a thick, suffocating silence. The salesmen, who moments before felt powerful in their mockery, suddenly had nowhere to hide from the shame burning their faces. Their eyes darted to the floor, to the cars, anywhere but toward him. Jimmy spoke no further. His response had been brief, plain, and unadorned. He did not raise his voice, demand apologies, or seek special treatment. He simply smiled with the serenity of a man who, though wounded, refused to surrender his dignity. That silence became a weapon more powerful than any speech. A silence that forced reflection, that spoke louder than words, that revealed the strength of a man who needed no display to command respect. The discomfort grew unbearable for the salesman. The one who had uttered the cruel line, "Will you pay with prayers?" began to sweat, his confidence collapsing like a house of cards. He couldn't believe he had mocked a figure who had preached to millions, sung hymns that touched hearts worldwide, and carried the name of his faith across nations. He tried to force a smile, pretending it had been a harmless joke, but the weight of condemning stares betrayed him. The other employees who had laughed moments earlier now edged away as though the floor might swallow them, desperate to avoid being tied to the humiliation they had fueled. "Sir," one of them stammered, his voice trembling, "forgive us. There must have been some misunderstanding." Jimmy looked at him calmly, saying nothing. That silence was more devastating than any rebuke. The salesman lowered his head, unable to hold his gaze. The child who had recognized him did not fully grasp the tension in the room. For him, it was simply thrilling to stand before the preacher his grandmother adored. "My grandma always cries when she hears you sing, 'I surrender all,'" the boy said with innocence. Jimmy smiled and gently patted the boy's head. That small human gesture moved some of the customers watching from afar. While adults carried prejudice and arrogance, it was a child who had reminded them of the essential truth. A person's worth is found in who they are, not in how they appear. Jimmy was not angry, but deeply reflective. Inside, a storm of emotions stirred within Jimmy. There was sadness at being judged by his appearance, compassion for those who could not see beyond clothing, and a deep desire to leave behind a lesson that would mark every soul present. Yet he knew that the best lessons are not taught with shouting or with revenge. True power lies in calmness, in showing that dignity remains intact even when others try to strip it away. He remembered his father's words from childhood, when he was just a boy in Louisiana. "Son, when someone disrespects you, hold your silence. That silence pierces deeper than any angry word." And now in that dealership, those teachings echoed with new force. The customers who had witnessed the scene began whispering among themselves. Some discreetly snapped photos with their phones, while others simply looked on with indignation at the salesman. The news that Reverend Swaggart was in the showroom spread like wildfire. Even office employees left their desks and hurried out to see what was happening. The manager, a man in a dark suit with a stern expression, appeared quickly, alarmed by the commotion. His eyes went first to Jimmy, then to his staff, and in an instant he understood something serious had occurred. "What is going on here?" he demanded with an authoritative tone. No one answered. Jimmy's silence was contagious, rendering everyone else speechless. The only voice that broke the stillness was the child's. "They were treating him badly because they thought he didn't have money," the boy said innocently. The manager went pale. The very idea that they had humiliated a customer, and worse still, a man recognized around the world, was a disaster. But Jimmy did not seek revenge. His humility kept him firm. He did not need anyone to kneel before him or pour out excuses. Within himself, he thought only of the lesson life was about to deliver, that one should never judge another by appearance. He looked around, took a deep breath, and chose to continue walking through the showroom as if nothing had happened. Slowly, he examined the cars while everyone else followed him with embarrassed and confused eyes. Each step he took was a reminder that true greatness is not measured by noise or anger, but by the serenity with which one faces injustice. The moment before the revelation was at hand. While tension gripped the room, Jimmy knew it was not yet the time for his final decision. He carried within him a surprise that would change the story completely, but he chose to wait. His silence was not emptiness. It was the prelude to something far greater. The salesmen, meanwhile, suffered with each passing second. Their discomfort showed in tight throats, trembling hands, clumsy attempts to move closer, desperate to undo the damage. But Jimmy gave them no chance. His silence was enough. It was already sowing the seed of a lesson. That day, everyone in the dealership began to learn that the power of silence can be stronger than rage. They learned that sometimes it is enough not to respond, and others will be forced to face their own guilt. Jimmy had been publicly humiliated, but he did not stoop to answer in kind. His silence became a mirror, forcing others to confront their own prejudice and arrogance. And the best was still to come, for while the salesmen struggled with their shame, Jimmy was preparing in quietness the decision that would not only leave them breathless, but would also mark the history of that dealership forever. The air inside the showroom grew unbearable. The silence of Jimmy Swaggart weighed on everyone like an immovable stone. The salesman, once arrogant and confident, now wavered between shame and fear of the consequences. The manager, brow furrowed, tried to restore order, but even he dared not break the solemn calm radiating from the preacher. And then reality broke through. An older woman, flipping through brochures beside her husband, squinted at Jimmy. Suddenly she gasped, "It's him! It's Reverend Swaggart!" The murmur spread like fire through dry grass. Some customers stepped closer cautiously, while others raised their phones to record. The employees who had once judged him for his plain suit now felt the ground opening beneath their feet. "Reverend Swaggart? Here?" whispered a young customer, his voice full of disbelief. "Of course," his companion replied. "Look at him. Who wouldn't recognize that voice and that face?" The salesmen began exchanging desperate glances. The most arrogant among them, the one who had delivered the cruel line about paying with prayers, was drenched in cold sweat. His pride crumbled into a pit of shame. Moments earlier, their eyes had been filled with judgment and disdain. Now they were shifting into looks of admiration, even pleading. They longed to earn his favor, to erase the offense as if it had never happened. But the contrast was too stark. and Jimmy saw it with perfect clarity. He did not need their sudden recognition, nor their shallow reverence. What he wanted was simply to fulfill his dream of choosing a car. Yet life had handed him an unexpected opportunity to prove, through action, that humility is worth more than any material wealth. The manager finally stepped forward. His voice tried to sound firm, but nervousness made it tremble. "Reverend Swaggart," he began, "on behalf of this dealership, I want to apologize. I'm sure there has been a misunderstanding. My employees, well, they did not know who you were." Jimmy listened in silence, not interrupting. The manager wiped his forehead, fully aware that every word sounded like a flimsy excuse when measured against the weight of what had just occurred. At last, Jimmy lifted his gaze. His voice, serene and deep, filled the space with a tone that commanded respect. "This isn't about who I am. The real issue is how you treated someone who walked in here with respect and with hope. Because if I were not Reverend Swaggart, would that justify humiliating me?" The silence that followed was heavier than stone. The employees bowed their heads. That simple, piercing question shattered every attempt at an excuse. Meanwhile, customers slowly drew nearer. Some asked for photos, others simply wanted to shake his hand. Jimmy received them with kindness, never losing the calmness that defined him. The little boy who had first recognized him looked up with shining eyes, proud as though he had revealed a hero to the world. Moments later, his grandmother arrived, tears streaming down her face as she thanked Jimmy for the many years of sermons and hymns that had carried her through life. The scene made the contrast even more painful for the salesman. Where they had seen only a common preacher, the people saw a man who had given them faith, hope, and songs of the soul, dignity above all. Jimmy raised no voice, demanded no vengeance. His revelation required no adornments. Simply being recognized by those who truly valued him was enough to expose the employee's arrogance. "I came here like anyone else," he said finally, with a calm that commanded reverence. "I didn't come seeking privilege. I came to buy a car, and instead I was met with prejudice." The words fell like stones on the hearts of the salesmen. The shame was unbearable. Some mumbled half apologies, others hid behind the cars, desperate to escape his gaze. But Jimmy had not yet revealed his full intent. Deep within, he carried a decision that would change the course of the day entirely. He would not simply choose one car. He would demonstrate that when humility is joined with resolve, it can strip arrogance of all its power. The revelation of his identity had shaken the foundation of the dealership, but what he was about to do would surpass every expectation. For it was not about being recognized, but about delivering a lesson that would endure forever. That day, everyone had seen the man behind the preacher, but soon they would see the preacher act with a greatness even more astonishing. The silence after his words still resonated through every corner of the showroom. The salesman, faces red with shame, had no idea how to repair the damage. The manager, sweating profusely, knew this was no mere customer service blunder, but a moral reckoning falling upon them like a hammer. Meanwhile, Jimmy continued walking among the vehicles, examining them with calm attention as if nothing had happened. His serenity unsettled them more than any outburst could, for it showed he had absolute control of the moment. His dignity shone brighter than the cars themselves under the showroom lights. Finally, he stopped before a massive black SUV with luxurious finishes. Placing his hand on its hood, he looked at the anxious manager, who rushed forward, desperate to know what he would say. "This one is very fine," Jimmy said quietly, "but I'm not going to take just one." The simple words left everyone in confusion. The salesman exchanged bewildered glances. Some thought perhaps he wanted to see other options first. Others assumed it was a joke meant to unsettle them. The manager, forcing a nervous smile, asked, "What do you mean, Reverend Swaggart?" Jimmy stepped forward, letting his eyes travel across the entire showroom where dozens of vehicles gleamed under the spotlights. Then, with calm determination, he spoke the words that left every soul breathless. "I will take the entire fleet." The silence that followed was so deep that even the hum of the air conditioner could be heard. No one dared move. No one dared breathe. The salesman thought they had misheard. "The entire fleet?" the manager repeated in disbelief. "Yes," Jimmy replied with absolute tranquility. "Every vehicle you have here, I'll buy them all." The impact was thunderous. A twilight gave someone a nose. Customers widened their eyes in astonishment while the salesman felt their world collapse. The very men who had mocked him moments before now stared with their mouths open, unable to comprehend what was unfolding before them. The manager tried to react quickly, though the sweat on his forehead betrayed him. Taking a shaky breath, he stammered, "Reverend Swaggart, this is unprecedented. We would need to prepare contracts, invoices, delivery logistics." "No problem," Jimmy interrupted softly. "I am willing to wait as long as necessary, but let it be clear, I am not leaving with just one car." The employees immediately understood this was no whim. Jimmy did not need dozens of vehicles for himself. His decision was symbolic, a way to show that no one should ever be judged by appearances. The silence he had used as his shield in the moments of humiliation was now transformed into a powerful action, impossible to ignore. There was no need for reproach. The purchase of the entire fleet was the clearest message they could ever receive. "When I walked in here," Jimmy continued, looking directly at the salesman, "I came with joy, like anyone who dreams of buying a car. But some of you chose to judge me without knowing who I was. Perhaps you thought my suit spoke louder than my words. Today I want to teach you, appearances deceive." The salesmen bowed their heads, ashamed. Their flushed faces said more than any apology could. The customers present began to clap, some with excitement, others with tears in their eyes. To them, this was not just the story of a famous preacher being recognized. It was the triumph of humility over arrogance, of respect over prejudice. The boy who had recognized him first jumped with joy, exclaiming, "I told you, it's Reverend Swaggart, and now he's buying all the cars." The manager, voice trembling, tried to regain composure. "Of course, Reverend Swaggart. We will do everything necessary to formalize this purchase." But deep inside, he knew this day would be recorded not only in sales history, but in memory as a moral lesson no one would ever forget. With his decision, Jimmy had not only stripped away the arrogance of those who humiliated him, but he had also elevated the moment to something historic. This was not merely a wealthy man making an extravagant purchase. It was a man responding to humiliation with greatness, proving that true strength is measured in the choices one makes under pressure. His silence had been his first weapon, his decision, the final blow, and the best was still to come. Seeing the reaction of those who had once laughed at him, now silenced and powerless before his dignity. That day, the entire dealership learned that humility may wear simple clothes, but it has the power to leave the whole world speechless. The echo of Jimmy's decision spread like unstoppable fire through the dealership. No one could believe what they had just heard. A moment ago, they had treated him with disdain, as if he were a man without resources, and now they stood watching as he, calm and unwavering, announced the purchase of the entire fleet. The manager, still incredulous, asked the staff to follow him to the office to prepare the paperwork, though his trembling hands betrayed his disbelief. Each step confirmed what seemed like a dream. This was real, and if it went through, it would be the largest sale in the history of the company, perhaps even in the country. The salesmen, still drowning in shame, now scattered like ants in a storm. They pulled out contracts, calculators, tablets, and papers, everything needed to begin the process. Some whispered to each other, "Did you hear what he said? The entire fleet. It can't be. We've never sold more than 5 cars in a single deal, and now all of them." What had begun as mockery was now becoming an unprecedented event. Every vehicle, from the simplest compacts to the most luxurious SUVs, would be purchased with Jimmy. While chaos stirred around him, Jimmy sat quietly in one of the offices, calm, observing the frenzy. His expression carried no vanity, no vengeance, only inner peace. He knew the true victory was not in signing papers, but in the lesson that would be etched into the minds of everyone who had witnessed this moment. When the manager timidly handed him the first folder of documents, Jimmy accepted it kindly, reviewed it carefully, and signed without hurry. "Don't worry about the logistics," he said in a serene tone. "I have a purpose in mind for these vehicles." The manager, intrigued, asked, "A purpose, Reverend Swaggart?" Jimmy smiled faintly but offered no details. His enigmatic answer only heightened the anticipation. Meanwhile, the salesman who had mistreated him lingered in a corner, silent, too ashamed to approach. They knew that any apology now seemed too small against the magnitude of what had transpired. The boy who had recognized him could not contain his excitement. He walked up and asked with innocence, "Are you really going to buy all the cars?" Jimmy leaned down, placed his hand on the boy's shoulder, and replied warmly, "Yes, son, and I want you to remember something. Never judge a person by what they wear. What matters is always in the heart." Jimmy's words to the boy echoed with power in every corner of the showroom. They were not reproaches, but each phrase was a mirror in which the salesman could see their arrogance reflected back at them. Within minutes, the dealership felt like the set of a film. Phone calls rang back and forth, offices filled with paperwork. Customers who had recorded the scene began sharing it online, and the news spread quickly across social media. In a matter of hours, this was no longer just a multi-million-dollar contract. It was becoming a moment that would mark the history of the place forever. No one would ever forget the day Reverend Jimmy Swaggart answered contempt with a legendary purchase. The manager, fully aware of what was unfolding, kept repeating, "Reverend Swaggart, this is historic, truly historic." And he was right. It wasn't simply the largest transaction ever recorded at the dealership. It was proof that dignity cannot be bought or sold, but it can shine like a beacon when expressed through action. As the contracts advanced, whispers filled the air. Everyone wondered, what would become of all these cars? Would he use them himself? Donate them? Was there some larger plan? Jimmy remained silent, letting the anticipation grow. What was certain was that the purchase of the entire fleet had become a symbol. It was not merely an act of financial might, but a moral victory that would forever change how that dealership treated its customers. The message was already clear. Humility, even when underestimated, has the power to write history in golden letters. The tension that had hung over the dealership all day shifted into awe and admiration when Jimmy, after signing the contracts, finally revealed his plan. The employees, who had felt the deepest shame of their lives only minutes before, waited with anxious hearts, uncertain of what he would say next. Jimmy rose calmly, placed his Bible under his arm, and walked to the center of the showroom where customers and staff watched in silence. His serene eyes scanned every corner, and when he spoke, his voice was clear, firm, and unshakable. "I want these vehicles to serve a purpose beyond luxury and display. I didn't buy them just for myself, I bought them to change lives." Murmurs swept through the crowd. The salesmen, their heads still bowed, began to raise their eyes. What they saw was no longer a simple customer, but a man whose generosity carried the weight of truth. Some customers could not hold back their tears. Jimmy's revelation reached far beyond a purchase. It was an act of generosity, of justice, of living faith. "Each vehicle," he continued, "will go to families in need, to organizations working to lift the lives of those who need it most. I want the joy they feel when receiving these cars to reflect what the gospel has given me throughout my life: hope, comfort, and opportunity." The silence that followed was profound. Everyone understood the magnitude of his words. This was not elegant revenge against those who had humiliated him. It was a message that transcended the personal, one that would touch the lives of many. The manager approached, still unable to fully grasp the scale of what was happening. "Reverend Swaggart, this is incredible. Are you certain? The logistics alone will be enormous." "Yes," Jimmy replied with a gentle smile, "but that will not stop me. The true reward lies in doing what is right and in showing that humility and generosity always triumph." As he spoke, the salesman began to understand the lesson. That humiliation they had tried to inflict turned into an opportunity for growth. The man they despised was not just a preacher they had seen on television, but an example of integrity, patience, and generosity. The little boy who had first recognized him clapped his hands with joy and shouted, "Yes, Brother Jimmy, thank you for helping everyone." His innocence and excitement deepened the understanding of all present. There was no revenge, no vanity, only a profound desire to do good and to teach a lesson that would never be forgotten. In the days that followed, the dealership turned into a beehive of activity. Every vehicle was carefully inspected, polished, and equipped with small notes of encouragement and scripture verses tucked into the glove compartments. The families who would receive them were chosen by local churches and charity organizations, ensuring that those who truly needed help would be blessed first. The very salesmen who had once mocked Jimmy now stood as witnesses to a life-changing lesson. They took part in the deliveries, and many of them experienced a deep transformation in their own outlook. They realized that arrogance and prejudice lead only to shame, while humility and respect open the door to gratitude and grace. The impact could not be contained. Local and national media outlets covered the remarkable story. Social media filled with images of struggling families receiving the keys to their new vehicles, tears streaming down their faces as they embraced Jimmy. Among the most viral was the photograph of the boy who had recognized him, a symbol of the power of childlike faith and pure recognition. Each vehicle represented far more than a mode of transportation. It represented hope, fresh opportunity, and the undeniable truth that acts of kindness ripple through generations. Jimmy Swaggart, through humility, patience, and faith, had transformed a moment of intended humiliation into a testimony of divine greatness. When the last truck was handed over, Jimmy offered no grand sermon, no self-promotion. He simply raised his hand in blessing, his eyes calm, his voice soft as he said, "Never judge a man by the clothes he wears. True greatness is measured by dignity, patience, and the willingness to give when the world expects you to take. Today is not about me, it is about him." The crowd fell silent, deeply moved. The salesmen, the clients, and the families alike understood the most important truth. Appearances mean nothing. True greatness flows from the heart aligned with God. That day, the dealership did not just close a historic sale, it became a living testimony that a single act of generosity can rewrite the story of everyone involved. The tale of Jimmy Swaggart and the fleet he chose to give away would live forever in the hearts of those who witnessed it. Because in the end, it was never about the cars. It was about the lesson, one carved not in contracts or headlines, but in the soul. True greatness is found in the heart, not in appearances.